later, the United States government comes out with the Indian Rights Act. So here's my first question. We've already talked about the Dawes Roll. We've already made it clear that if you do your genealogy and do your family tree, you may end up having ancestors that are by blood tied to this land. However, you still could have gotten reclassified. Your family could have gotten reclassified, even though they're on the Dawes Roll. Now here we are in 1968. They do an Indian Rights Act 7 days after the United States government kills King. My first question, Judge Joe Brown, if you can share that act, Chief Biko, Title II of the 1968 Indian Rights Act. Who is the Indian that the United States government is referring to 7 days after it assassinated Martin Luther King? Let's get into it. Because it's interesting that I'm American Indian by blood, but my family's been reclassified this whole time, and I'm not a citizen of an American Indian tribe. So how that work? How you got ancestors that's American Indian by blood, but you still end up getting caught up in the Negro black color quagmire?
Well, okay, here's what happens. Do you live as a member of the tribe? Are you subject to the tribal jurisdiction separate and apart from the jurisdiction of the United States or some other state?
Me personally, no, but an ancestor, well, let me ask this question to explain to the viewers. If you got an ancestor on the Dawes Roll, what does that mean? Does that mean that they lived in the jurisdiction, or does that mean they were just moved out there and got put on?
What it means is another ancestor, if not one listed on the roll, decided he would migrate to the United States by going 10 miles off the reservation. So he's born on American soil, so he's already an American citizen if he's not a citizen of an Indian nation.
Well, hey, hold on, Judge. How can you be a citizen of said government when prior to 1964 you weren't?
No, you were a citizen. See, from the date the Constitution was ratified in 1789, which is now 235 years ago, it defines citizen as anyone born on American soil.
That doesn't line up with our history, Judge Joe Brown. That's kind of like this, the treaty saying treaty, but it wasn't a treaty, or there's no declaration of war.
But see, it's this. Remember, it says non-tax paying Indians?
Yes.
In other words, you lived on Indian territory in an Indian nation on a reservation or whatever it was from 1789 on. You didn't have to pay taxes to the U.S. government because you were part of a sovereign entity that was subject to treaty relations with the United States of America. Correct. So if you lived as a Native American, then you exercised your citizenship choices to be a citizen, a subject of your tribal nation. If you didn't live on their territory and you chose to pay taxes, since you were born in the continental United States and it did not set forth any specific areas saying Indian reservations are excluded, Indian territories are excluded, you were also possessed of dual citizenship as an American citizen. So you could claim either.
But there's a flaw in that, Judge Joe Brown, because if you couldn't vote prior to 1965 and you was in an active war zone prior to 1964 due to segregation, how are you sitting up here trying to convince us that if you weren't on a reservation and you was under United States government jurisdiction that you were a citizen, but you could
vote
before 1965?
Yeah.
So what was the point of
the just that for Negroes, colored, what happens is some of the former members of the Southern Confederacy, the secessionists, which was the term used at the time, they decided once they became reunified, since the Constitution permitted them to set forth the qualifications to vote in state elections, they started doing stuff like having literacy tests, having other obstructions, physical violence to keep people from showing up. But see, like Tennessee, for example, never took the vote from the colored nor the Negro, because there was a guy named Boss Crump who was brought in to save the property interest of the first black millionaire. His name was Robert Church in Memphis, whose daddy was the richest plantation owner in Mississippi prior to the Civil War, but lost all of his legitimate sons in the Civil War, had no daughters. And if he died without heirs, all of his belongings and money would have gone to the state of Mississippi. They call it escheating, Escheat. Now, what wound up happening is he wound up pushing these laws I talked about earlier about if you had no more in Tennessee than 1/8 known colored ancestry, you could be declared officially Caucasian. Well, Robert Church had a very fair-skinned Octroon mama, so he qualified, but out of respect for his mother, he declined to become officially white. So Tennessee law is replete with all kinds of weirdnesses until you figure out what it's all about. It was justification for taking his property. So he found this real smart young white lawyer. His name was Crump. And he sent him to Memphis to protect his son. Trump figured out that if he kept the blacks into the voting, kept them in the voting game, he could rely upon them as a huge block of voters and win every election, even though he never had a white majority, a large minority of whites. So he wound up controlling Memphis politics, West Tennessee, and then the politics in all of Tennessee. So in Tennessee, blacks never lost the right to vote.
Let's
Or
back up
not
a
the
bit.
right, they never lost the exercise of the vote because Boss Crump depended on it. Boss Crump was so powerful that the Green Bay Packers and Detroit Lions played an exhibition game here in 1952. He had never seen a full football game, so he wanted to see it. 15 minutes late, word went down to the bench that if you nice boys want to get back on the train to Green Bay and Detroit, you will kick this game off all over again so Mr. Crump can see a full game. It's first and only time they've ever done it in NFL history. They stopped the game and kicked off all over again.
Let's get back, Judge Joe Brown. And I want you to keep it simple and I want you to straight talk for the viewers. Okay. What you're telling me, I want you to talk to me like I'm a third grader. I don't care. Maybe I'm the only one that didn't hear you answer the question. You're saying if somebody in my family does our family tree and they find out that their family is on the Dawes Roll, any Dawes Roll, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, you're saying if that ancestor left Indian territory, then falls under the jurisdiction of the United States government, is subject to tax under the United States government, right? You're saying that they still had the right to vote and were treated as citizens under the United States government. That doesn't line up with why you need a 1964 and a 1965 Civil Rights Act. That doesn't add. Am I the only one that get that?
Well, the problem
am I the only one that
you're making the thing where is like what you're classifying is Native American, Indian, Black, whatever. See, remember, if your mama wasn't a slave, I don't care who your daddy was, you're not a slave. So there are these people who do not need to be freed. There are people who got free or were freed men, and then there were people who never needed to be freed.
I'm with you.
3 types of people.
So who is this right here in 1968, 7 days after King? Who got these rights of Indians?
You're talking about the people who never needed to be free. They lived on tribal reservations. They operated as part of the unity of the hunters and warriors and tribesmen.
Well, they was already set up in the 1866 Indian
Yeah,
Treaty.
well, it was set up long before that. You're
Right. So
talking about the Iroquois Confederation. You're talking about their constitution.
well,
See, they have their own nationality, but essentially what they become is migrants. They went 10 miles that way, 4 miles that way, and they left the reservation.
all right, stay with me,
And
Judge Brown. Stay with me real quick. Let me interject this. You got the Iroquois and you got the Muskogee or the Creek Confederacy in the South.
sure,
Okay. Now, in 1866, they moved the original nations that were east of the Mississippi and they put them in Indian territory. They moved them west of the Mississippi.
1830s, that's when they started Trail of Tears, the Indian Removal Act.
Correct. They set them up and everything. So if they set them up in 1830 and then finalized everything with the treaties in 1866, how can the United States government then double back in 1968 and give them same group of people?
Because there's still people on reservations. There's still people that are subject to the Indian police and Indian or reservation tribal justice with the courts, judges, and whatever. In the
Am I the only one not
19
getting this? I don't mean to interject. Am I the only one not getting this? Because all
Yeah,
y'all looking like y'all
something ain't connecting with the
well, here's
promises
what
and
I'm
part.
saying. Okay. I went to Montana one time. I met a chief. He invited me out to the tribe. They have their own courts. They have tribal police. They have their own laws, rules, enforcement process. And it supersedes by the treaty they have American law. But if they don't live on the reservation, then they become subject to Montana state law and they become subject to U.S. law. But that's in the 1990s. That's in the 21st century.
Are you a dual citizen, Judge Joe Brown? Are you a citizen of the Choctaw?
Well, I've never lived on a reservation.
But are you a citizen of the Choctaw government?
It's not citizen of the Choctaw government. It's I am a Choctaw. What that means is, are you a citizen of Ireland and the United States because you have an Irish ancestor? Or are you Irish, but you happen to be a citizen of the United States? Did you ever see?
No, we're talking Choctaw. We ain't talking about Irish. I'm just asking.
No, I mean, but it's the same thing. In other words, you have a status, but the difference is the Choctaw Nation is not located across 4,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean. It's right here. Mexico, you go to Tijuana, you before all this mess, you just kept driving south past San Diego and you went across the border. You go hang out TJ. You drive back across.
But you're citizen. Are you citizen of the Choctaw today?
I am a Choctaw.
So are you a citizen of the
I'm not subject to their jurisdiction because I've never lived on their tribal lands and I've not submitted to it. And as an adult, I've paid taxes, I think, since I've been 15 years old.
So the U.S. government, not the Choctaw.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Chief. Go ahead, Geechee God.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask Judge a quick question. So would it be safe to say because you haven't done certain things as far as tribal affiliation that you were basically just reclassified as a Negro and has lived as such a citizen of the said United States, even though you could technically be a citizen of said nation if you were to probe and pry, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So
now,
there's a
here, let me break it down this way. There have been governors, senators, and congressmen that never got discriminated against, even though they were 1/4, 1/2 Indian. I got somebody I know, You know, you talk about these blonde-haired, blue-eyed Indians, you know, you're still Indian if you're 1/16th. I know one guy who's got a big chain of restaurants and businesses, very wealthy Tennessean. Jesus Christ, Judge, I ain't seen you in a long damn time. You look like a straight up white boy. You just get kind of dark red, brownish when he gets suntan. Sounds like a redneck. Jesus, good seeing you, son. Good seeing you. God dang. And he's half Cherokee.
So let me ask you a question real quick, Judge. So it's clear, and I think it's safe to say, right, being a citizen of a tribal nation is not a bloodline, right? So you could be a Cherokee you could be a Cherokee citizen, right? You could be a
You
Cherokee
can be
citizen,
adopted.
right? Okay, so
It says in the act you were looking at, including the people who are adopted or under their protection.
So we have people who are tribal citizens, right? Who are not of the blood of the actual or an actual descendant of said people who originated or created said tribes, correct?
Well, very few.
Hold on, Judge. Hold on. If that's the
Oh,
case,
go ahead, go
then
ahead.
that's in direct violation of the Iroquois Constitution. If you can pull up
No,
the
it's
Iroquois,
not.
well, let me show
Not the Iroquois Constitution does not apply to all native tribes.
You're correct. You're correct. You're correct. We're talking about the Creek.
And what we're talking about is a condition that applies generally to all native tribes, not just those who were members of the Iroquois Confederation, which, by the terms that are designated in their constitution, have been removed from that status because of what? Affiliation with what? Outsiders. They have separate treaty arrangements with the United States government under Article 6. Because they have these treaty representation or relations with the United States, they have violated the specific terms of the Iroquois Confederacy Constitution. They're no longer members of that confederacy.
Here's the deal, Judge Joe Brown. I'm gonna straight talk with you. I'm gonna straight talk with you. It sounds like what happened is when they started relocating Americans from the Southeast in the Indian Territory, once those governments lost their de jure status and they created this new 5 civilized tribes, bloodline lineage became bloodline and membership. And that goes directly against the rules on this land. Whereas if you're not by blood, you remember we talked about this earlier, you can't vote, you can't get in business matters. The European knew that. So what they had to do was set up a proxy 5 civilized tribes, and then they could shoehorn their way in.
Okay.
Like Geechee said, become members. Along
let me try this to explain it. You're a Cherokee. You live in Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm.
You're a Creek. You lived in Tennessee.
Okay.
Let's supposing that your sister winds up running into your buddy who's a Cherokee, and your sister's Creek, and your homeboy is Cherokee, and they get married. Now what are you? What are your nephews and nieces?
Still American by blood.
It's Creek.
Creek or Cherokee?
By Indian
half
law,
Cherokee, one half Creek.
Yeah.
You see how that works? When you start intermingling, you also get this thing where maybe your mama is white. Why? Because it's 140 years ago and they raided this white settlement and they kidnapped this white squaw who became member of the tribe and had 6 children with sub chief so-and-so. See how that goes?
So Judge, real quick, if you were to mix a Creek and a Cherokee, those are still supposed to be two individuals of the same gene pool,
No, no, no,
right?
no, 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 no. Forget
Oh,
the gene core. What's the difference in genetics between a German and a Frenchman?
absolutely nothing. There's
But
customs and
they
culture.
killing each other in World
But
War
hold on,
One and
hold on,
beginning
Judge.
of
Hold
World
on.
War
Listen.
Two.
Right, but we're talking about, right, we're having a discussion about membership, right, and who is being attested or acknowledged as certain people and who are not, and how is this ultimately going?
I'm
If
trying to
we,
explain that. It's just like you have the same ancestral stock who can be a German or he can be French or members of the remote distant family, same family, are Frenchmen and Germans. You can have situations where blood kin relatives are members of two separate Indian nations. One's Cherokee and one's Creek.
Mhm. Just like
So
we could have two different individuals, right, of the same family. One's a Christian, one's a Muslim, right? But
yeah, that too.
that doesn't change, right? The overall gene pool of the origin of these people, correct?
Yeah, but you see, your religion these days has nothing to do with your national identity. Let's supposing that you leave Nigeria and you move here and you have children, but your brother stays in Nigeria, he has children. So the cousins, first cousins, some of them are citizens of the United States of America, and some of them are citizens of Nigeria. You see, they
Correct.
belong to, in effect, two different nations. When you say Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, you're talking about five, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 separate Indian nations. So somebody can be related, but by dint of marriage, by dint of circumstance, they can be members of two separate Indian nations. See, every tribe is somewhat analogous to a separate nation. They happen to be here. If you were born on this soil, you're also automatically a citizen of this conglomerate known as the United States of America or the United Nations of North America. You're also a member of whatever tribe you're born into. If you choose to live on those tribal lands, subject to the tribal jurisdiction, laws, enforcement, and administration, you
So
don't get.
let me ask you one question, Judge. Now, y'all going back to what y'all said earlier, y'all talked about the Indian Removal Act, you talked about the Trail of Tears, how a certain amount of individuals, right, were in a certain land and then in a certain geographical location, and then they were moved, right? Now, in that story, what I'm not hearing is that all of the Indians were not moved. All of the Indians were not killed, right?
No,
Hold on. I haven't heard any reference to the Gullah Wars. I did hear you say the Seminoles, right? And I wanted to hear more about what you calling the Seminoles, right? Because from what history says is that there was a large demographic of melanated or dark-skinned people who were Indians, right? Specifically, customary by blood and birthright, right? Who fought to protect their land during the same time period that you're saying they're sending all the Indians away, right? So history in itself, right, is not actually going along with itself because in one breath, you have allegedly all of the Native Americans moving to the West and the Americas having the military might to do so, right? To move all of the indigenous people on their own land out, right? Whilst fighting a war with so-called freed slaves who ran off of plantations and other Indian tribes for over 100+ years, right? So how does that coincide, right? When the American government, who you just said earlier, was just coming into its inceptions, 13 little bitty weak nations coming together, right, in this wilderness, as you described it, right? Going up against a a vast confederacy, as we spoke about, of indigenous people who had their own language, who had their own constitutions, who had their own customs prior to the inception of America, right? Indigenous people had all of these things, right? So where does that actually go in the storyline of America when we're talking about Indian removal, right? The Great Migrations, where does the so-called Black population of Indians that were in the Southeast who were fighting wars and things of that nature throughout, what happened to those individuals?
Nowadays, the events are listed as the Seminole Indian Wars. At the time, and if you research the War Department records, they're referred to as the Colored Wars. From way before the revolution that led to the Constitution being adopted in 1789, slaves had been running away and settling with the Seminole Indian tribes. It's a lot of Black slaves that escaped. When they married into the tribe, they picked Indian wives. The children that they had with the Indian wives were not slaves because they couldn't be, because the mother wasn't a slave. Your status as a slave or not a slave was determined by your mother's status unless somebody freed you. If your mama was free, you were free. So,
Judge, was there Native American slaves at this time?
They refused to submit to slavery. They'd starve. That's why they brought in the African Negroes that they had.
Okay. You can't do that, Judge.
Judge, hold on. There's a vast history, Judge, of Native Americans being sold in slavery. I'm talking about on plantations, just same exact story that they say happened to Negroes.
Yeah,
this happened to Native Americans.
Long enough, we'd starve ourselves. We refuse to be slaves.
So you're saying from your research that you don't know the history of the hundreds of thousands of Native Americans?
No, that's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
If you think like a Native American,
mm-hmm.
you won't be a slave. That's a choice. You submit. What is it that the white folk had in the 50s? Better dead than red? Or way before that, I regret that I have but one life to give for my country? See, in other words, you are committed to dying for principle. The slave is somebody that does not have a sufficiently strong set of principles to die for. He's interested in survival. For example, if you had intelligent cows, why should a cow live to serve as food for the people that are raising the herd? There's no point in being alive. So the cow would not eat and would starve to death. If the cow, understanding that it was going to be used as a draught animal or be eaten, that says there's something about or lacking about that animal's character if it had the intelligence to realize its circumstances and it chose to remain part of that herd that was going to be used for domestic purposes. Now, the Native Americans, however you classify them, refused to be slaves. They made slaves of them, but they died. That's why the Spanish started bringing in the Negro slaves, which is where the term Negro came to be applied to the American Negro, because they made good slaves. They did not have the mindset of the Native Americans. So what you have
just to be clear, you're saying that the Native Americans were not subservient, but the so-called Negroes were. But I'm saying that's a contradiction, because the Gullah Wars themselves, Bacon Rebellion, right? Since inception, hold on, we have several episodes where Negroes, right, were rebelling and whooping on European ass, correct? Throughout American.
But the point is when you get to talking about the Carolinas and what's going on, there are always some people that understand what being free is about, that think like free men. They won't put up with it. Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, they were not slaves, by the way. They were freemen. and decided that they were going to deal with freeing the slaves, but they got betrayed. You know, there
But
were
what
black
was the
folk,
difference, Judge,
Negroes,
between what was the
with
difference
John
between the
Brown when he
slave
took
that
Harper's
was
Ferry.
working on the plantation, right? And then decided, okay, today I'm no longer going to do this. I'm going to run off. At that point, right, we're talking about a condition, right? We're talking about someone who has found themselves in a condition, and then at a certain point, they decided no longer to be in that condition. That is not specific to genetics in reference to, well,
Oh,
Native
no, it's not.
Americans
See, that's the
didn't
point.
want to be slaves, and so-called African Americans did. That was incorrect, in my
That's
opinion.
the point. It's not genetic. It's got to do with your mindset. See, the people that got enslaved in Africa and sent over here weren't the warriors. If a warrior got caught, it's a different kind of thing. They did not make good slaves. Some of them jumped off the boat. Some of them just said, shoot me, kill me, I'm not doing this. And they did. So you got the more compliant ones over here. But then again, you didn't weed all of them out. You got some unruly, you know, like you have dogs that can't be tamed because they have too much wolf in them. Wolves don't make good domestic animals because they have too much wild in them. They haven't been domesticated. But you have Negroes who were bred and domesticated. You have Negroes who had the elements of enslavement inserted in their culture, so they taught themselves to be slaves. It's interesting. When you listen to free men and you listen to people who still think like a slave, you can hear the difference if you know what you're listening to.
Let's
It's
stay on
like,
track, Judge Joe Brown. No, great bill. I don't mean to cut you off, Judge Joe Brown. That's a great bill you and Geechee are having. I just for the viewers' purpose, we're in the 1968 Indian Rights Act. Judge Joe Brown is saying that this act, 7 days after King was assassinated, refers to Indians that are already on reservations. I want to move forward a little bit from that, and let's get to 1971, and let's get to this Black Congressional Caucus. So all the work that was done in the 1960s, now we know that it was a military act in 1964 to end segregation, to keep the morale up of the soldiers. And then you get 1965 Voting Rights Act. And then in 1968, after King was assassinated by the federal government and its Marines and its FBI, they turn around and give rights in a government again to a group of people who are already on reservations. Now let's get to 1971 and this Black Caucus. How did this caucus get formed? And is this caucus, according to the theory of operation within the United States government,